Hi, everybody. I'm Becky Annunzio. Nice to let you see me in person. I chose to do alcohol and its effects on the body. The learning segment is adolescence. Maybe a health class of freshmen or sophomores, depending on when they're going to be in health. The lesson is intended to help students understand what blood alcohol concentration is, understand what might affect a person's blood alcohol concentration, and then understand what the physical and mental effects of alcohol on a person could be. So this lesson meets standards 1 and 5. Students will be able to comprehend concepts related to health promotion and disease prevention to enhance health, and students will be able to demonstrate the ability to use decision-making skills to enhance health. So the specific learning objectives are going to be students will be able to identify the mental and physical effects of alcohol on the body by the end of the lesson. Students will be able to use fatal vision goggles or drunk goggles to discover the level of impairment in relation to blood alcohol concentration during an activity. And students will be able to plan how they or another could avoid drinking and driving by suggesting methods to preemptively take steps to avoid poor decision making. As we know, alcohol impairs judgments and decision making. So preparing a plan ahead of time is really important to ensure that in the moment we don't, our impairment does not lead to poor decision making. So my objective as a presenter or a teacher that I've been trying to work on, so I'm trying to work on this in many of my lessons, is when I ask for student responses or I'm trying to elicit conversation with students, I tend to call on the first hand that shoots up really quickly, or call on one of the first hands. I don't allow enough thinking time for students that maybe need time to process long enough, right? And so what I want to do is I've been consciously trying to take 30 to 60 seconds before calling on anyone when I'm asking for a response to ensure that everyone has the time to think about what they'd like to say. I've seen it really improve some of the classroom conversations, and it has allowed students, more students, the opportunity to engage in the classroom conversations and to give responses. And so it's something that I've really been trying to practice. I tend to think fast and talk fast, so I'm trying to really make a conscious effort of taking a breath, waiting, letting the whole class take a breath, think, and then gain responses from students. So the introduction activities will probably take only about 5 minutes. The first introduction activity is going to focus on what blood alcohol concentration is. And so that's the effects of alcohol on a human body. It depends on the amount of alcohol in the blood, known as the blood alcohol concentration. And here is a infographic that I would share either in Google Classroom or I would, project after we do the introductory activity about blood alcohol concentration. Now, while I would share that blood alcohol concentration infographic after the students do one of their developmental activities, we would start by talking about what one drink is as a classroom together. And I would explain, right, a 12 fluid ounce beer, 4 to 5 fluid ounces of wine, or 1.5 ounces of spirits. I like to really make sure that they understand that when we talk about like a beer, that we're talking like a domestic, right? Or even, a fairly popular import like a Heineken or a Miller product, and that the craft beers, right, that are huge in breweries, and that's a very popular thing now, that is a whole different ballgame when it comes to being one drink. And they need to, when they're of age and they're looking at stuff like that, they need to be really mindful about the alcohol by volume in craft beers, because as most of us know as adults, right, they can be anywhere from 4.5% alcohol upwards of 12% alcohol. And so if you're drinking something that's 12% alcohol, one 12-ounce craft beer is going to be equal to 3 Miller Lights, right? And so we need to understand that. And then, when it comes to spirits, we're specifically speaking of 80 proof, and that the proof can vary on spirits, but it's a decent rule of thumb, right? That basically 1.5 ounces, which is equivalent to what would be in a shot or a shot glass, which is also what should be poured into a standard drink. However, we all know bartenders that have a heavy pour, or someone that thinks they're doing you a favor, and so they need to be mindful of that as well. Then the final thing that I would need to do to lay groundwork for them to understand why this is important is understanding what the legal limit to drive is, and letting them know that if someone is above 21 years old, the legal limit is 0.08, which is roughly the average of 1 drink per hour. But that there's zero tolerance for underage drinking and driving, and this means that the legal limit is 0.01 for those under 21, right? So if there's any alcohol in your system, you're above the legal limit if you are a minor or under 21, under drinking age. So the developmental activities, which would take about 30 minutes or so, right, are going to follow here. So taking about 15 minutes or so, thinking back to blood alcohol concentration, as I had showed you that infographic, that would be something that I would share out afterwards. So they had that as a resource, but I would like them to discover blood alcohol concentration themselves. And so my room orientation is set up in tables. And so it's not necessarily a think pair share, right? But they're talking in their groups. You could do this where they turn and talk to their elbow neighbor or to their face neighbor, if you're in other, room orientations. But in small groups, right, like their tables or their face or elbow neighbors, they would be asked to use their devices. We're a one-to-one school, so everyone has a device here, to look up and list blood alcohol concentration levels and the physical and mental effects of the alcohol, right? And so I would specifically assign each table or each pair a specific level or a couple specific levels, right? Instead of requiring them to have everything. So, and then they're going to use their whiteboard or a dry erase board to list the assigned blood alcohol concentration levels and how each level impacts a person. They should include the physical and the mental effects, right? And then they should also indicate roughly how many drinks equals that blood alcohol concentration. Once they work in their group for a short period of time and they get their answers down on their whiteboard, I'm then going to ask a student to be our classroom note taker and come up to the large whiteboard for the classroom. And I'm going to ask for the responses. So we're going to go around to each table, and our note taker is going to, basically write an entire list on our whiteboard of what the blood alcohol concentrations are and what physically and mentally happens to the person at those levels of intoxication. Once that's done, I would then also ask as a follow-up question to blood alcohol concentration, some of the factors that can affect a blood alcohol's concentration. Some of the things that I'm looking for are, gender or weight, or if one had eaten before they had started drinking, are they taking any medications, what's the time that they're drinking in, right? Are we slamming shots, or are we slowly sipping wine over, 6 hours, right, at a party? And so, so I would, ask them, for the factors. As you can see here, there's an active link down here. This would be something that I would share in Google Classroom after this lesson is done, which gives additional information on what affects the blood alcohol concentration of a person. So the second half of the developmental activities, which is about 15 minutes or so, is more of like a hands-on learning lab. And so here at school, we have fatal vision goggles, which basically simulate the what it might look like to be intoxicated, right? Obviously, we're not talking about queasy stomach and all, but you can take a look at the goggles here, right? They would put them on. If you can see, they have at the top here, right? They've got a alcohol level that they're simulating. And so this one is simulating a 0.25 and what it might look like and how they might see things. And so we have multiple pairs of these that go from varying at like a 0.08 to a 0.12, and then degrees up. I think there's 4 or 5 different levels of them. And so students are asked to perform varying physical tasks without the goggles, and then also wearing the altering goggles to compare the experiences. Some of the physical tasks that they're asked to do are to walk a straight line. We would tape it on the floor, throw and catch like a soft, small dodgeball type thing, stand on 1 foot for 30 seconds, and then like weave in and out of cones while walking. They're asked to complete a worksheet about how their abilities were prior to the goggles and while wearing the goggles. So on the next slide, there's an example of what this worksheet looks like. So as you see here, right, we've got the trials with no goggles, and then we've got the trials with the goggles. I asked them to identify what BAC of goggles they're wearing. And, so then they work with a partner, work in small groups, and they go through and they complete these physical tasks. I will say the kids really enjoy this one. They have a really good time. They are quite surprised by how altered their vision can be, how altered their motor skills can be while wearing the goggles. I think that they, prior to this activity, they really underestimate what it's like to be intoxicated or how that could be, right? For a lot of them, it's really eye-opening, and they've said things like, I don't understand how a person could even get behind the wheel of a car like this. Like what would, like it's wild. Like I see 2 complete things in front of me. And so, they start to think critically about like why a person would make that decision, and how people choose to do that. And so it really gets them thinking about intoxication levels and personal safety and things like that. The second part of that worksheet is these reflection questions, right? And so I look for them to tell me what activities seemed most difficult with the goggles and why. And then I also ask them to think, right? What are some things a person could do to avoid drinking and driving? So like I mentioned earlier, like being prepared, having a plan to avoid the judgment impairment that occurs when we drink, right? Our judgment is impaired, and so we make decisions saying that we're okay to drive. However, if we had a plan ahead of time, it might limit the chance that we continue to make poor decisions. And so some of the answers I get for that are, take an Uber. You can't drive if you don't have a car there. Always go out with like a designated driver, so you've got your one sober friend all the time. Make sure that you walk, type of thing. And so in this day and age, it's so much easier with Uber and rideshare to avoid drinking and driving. It's not as difficult as it used to be maybe 15 or 20 years ago when you had to call a cab. And so these reflection questions are like the conclusion activity, and it only takes a couple minutes. It's a large group. You can do it where they are individually answering if you want it on the worksheet, or you can just have it as a large group discussion where they can share their thoughts in the activity, particularly to share the answers from the reflection questions on the worksheet. Like I said, you can have them write it down first. It does help students to have fluid thoughts, right? If some, gives them time to think about it, to come up with a response. So that does help situations of engaging a more robust and thoughtful conversation. It helps to elicit responses from students that do not typically raise their hand because they've had time to prepare their answer. So, that's a good practice to do too. And these are the resources I use to get my information. I also wanted to offer to anyone, if they're interested and want to reach out via email, let me know. I'm happy to share the lesson plan and the lesson plan slides if you wanted them. If you happen to be a high school health teacher, middle school teacher, you're someone responsible for teaching a lesson about alcohol, I'm happy to share over the lesson that we do here at school. Thanks for listening to my presentation. I look forward to feedback, and I will see you in class.